Welcome to TOCHI Stories. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on post notification because it will mean the whole world to me. Now let's get right into the story. Brace yourself. In the sun-bleached streets of ABA, life was as unforgiving as the concrete gutters that lined the market roads. In a corner compound where tenants whispered over basins and children played barefooted, Ruth was the name on every young boy's lips. At 16, she already carried herself like a woman who knew the power of her beauty. Tall, brown-skinned with full cheeks, a small waist, and eyes that held defiance like fire. But her mother, Mama Agnes, was always a few steps behind her with warnings and threats. Men will use you and dump you just like your father did me. You want to repeat the same mistake. Ruth would roll her eyes and tighten her wrapper. The words bounced off her chest like dried beans on concrete. She wasn't trying to be like her mother. She wanted more. She wanted lace gowns, golden heels, and love that came in the form of loud motorcycles and scented love letters. Her friends called her Ruth the Red Pepper, beautiful but dangerous, and Ruth didn't mind. It made her feel alive. The conflict between mother and daughter grew like a wound that refused to heal. Ruth had mastered the art of rebellion, sneaking out after dark, lying with bold eyes, sneaking in through the back gate before dawn. Her mother tried everything, locking her in, tearing her clothes, threatening her with curses. But nothing worked. The more she resisted, the more Ruth clung to the taste of freedom like air after suffocation. And the source of her defiance had a name: Chuka. He was the neighborhood mechanic with broad shoulders, grease-stained fingernails, and a voice that dripped honey. Chuka could talk his way out of a coffin, and Ruth was his most willing listener. He told her stories about Lagos, about starting his own auto business, about buying land in Asaba. "You and me, baby. We'll make it big," he'd whisper in her ear as they sat on his workbench under the twilight sky. And Ruth believed him. In Chuka, she saw escape. In his eyes, she saw a life that wasn't trapped in Mama Agnes' angry shadows. Mama Agnes was at her wit's end. One night, after catching Ruth sneaking back home from a street party, she locked her in the house, took her phone, and swore to the heavens that she'd rather bury Ruth than let her fall like she did. But Ruth, stubborn and fueled by the recklessness of youth, broke the window the next night and jumped out barefoot. It was the beginning of a choice that would shatter her entire future. As she ran down the road into the arms of Chuka, into the music, into the noise, she had no idea she was walking straight into the arms of regret. Chuka knew all the right things to say. He wasn't educated, but his words had rhythm. He talked about opening his own workshop someday, about traveling to Lagos, about buying Ruth lace fabrics and real gold jewelry. Under the orange glow of roadside bulbs and between shared bottles of malt and grilled suya, he made her feel like royalty. Ruth was addicted not just to him, but to the version of herself she became when she was with him. He never judged her, never called her stubborn like her mother did. He lifted her chin, kissed her gently, and said, "I see you, baby girl. You're not like the rest." And so, when he asked her to come over that evening and stay the night, she didn't hesitate. She gave him her body, her trust, her soul, all wrapped in foolish hope. But just a month later, her cycle stopped. Her stomach felt strange. Her mornings came with nausea. The fear in her chest began to swell. The moment she told her mother, the house turned into a war zone. Mama Agnes grabbed her by the collar, cursed the day she was born, and fell to the floor, screaming. The neighbors heard everything. "You've brought shame to my name," she shouted. "You want to end up like me, abandoned with a child? You'll carry this cross alone." That night, Ruth slept outside with her head on a cement step and her heart drowning in confusion. She wasn't just pregnant, she was unwanted. School was over. Her mother stopped talking to her. Every stare in the neighborhood became a slap. Even her friends disappeared. And through it all, Chuka remained her last hope. Surely, the man who said he loved her would step up, right? Chuka changed overnight. His smiles became thin. His responses turned cold. He avoided eye contact. "You sure it's mine?" he asked bluntly, wiping oil off his hands. "How many people you been with?" Ruth stared at him, mouth open, disbelief choking her. "Chuka, it's you." I've only been with you." He shrugged, didn't meet her eyes, and mumbled something about needing time. A week later, he was gone, packed up and moved to a different town, leaving no contact, no closure, no goodbye. It was a kind of betrayal that burns without fire, and Ruth was left to carry the consequences alone. Her stomach grew, her heart sank, and with every day that passed, she began to resent the life growing inside her. Ruth's postpartum weeks were soaked in silence. The world felt heavier now, the air, the sun, the looks from people in the compound. Her mother didn't show up at the clinic, and the only thing Ruth had to cradle besides her baby was rage. She looked at Alikia with cold eyes. The baby looked just like her father, the same lips, the same nose, the same smirk that once made Ruth's knees go weak. But now it made her fists clench. She began to blame the baby for everything. "You ruined my life," she muttered under her breath. "You are the reason I'm stuck here." Ruth fed her, yes. She bathed her, yes. But she never smiled at her, never kissed her forehead. The bond that should have bloomed between mother and child had been severed before it even began. Alikia cried more than other babies, and Ruth barely flinched. The neighbors whispered about her. Some pitied her. Others mocked her. "Fine girl turn a shallow," they said. Her mother warned her. Ruth heard it all. It hardened her. She stopped caring what anyone thought. She stopped combing her hair, stopped wearing makeup, stopped dreaming. Days blurred into weeks. She began leaving Alikia alone in the room while she went out at night, sometimes to drink, sometimes to sit in silence under the bridge, sometimes just to forget. On the nights she stayed in, she stared at the ceiling for hours, numbing herself with cheap gin and packets of codeine cough syrup. It dulled the pain. It silenced the blame. And, in the morning, she would drag herself up and pretend to function. By the time Alikia turned 3, Ruth had stopped calling her by name. "You," she'd say. "Get away from me." She started using drugs to sleep, codeine syrup and cheap pills from a friend. It numbed her guilt and buried her dreams further. When Mama Agnes came around, she sighed at the sight of her daughter and granddaughter, 2 broken pieces of a house that never healed. "You see your life," she said one day. "Don't come crying to me." And she never did. Ruth never cried to anyone again. But deep down, she knew she was becoming the very thing she had once sworn to escape. Bitter, broken, and bound to a past she couldn't undo. The years between Alikia's 3rd and 7th birthday passed in a blur of bitterness and barely suppressed rage. Ruth's world had become a repeating cycle of noise, smoke, and regret. The only stability in her life was the way she clung to her vices. Cigarettes in the morning to calm her nerves. Gin in the afternoon to dull her shame. Codeine at night to silence the cries she swore were louder than they should be. Her small room reeked of stale alcohol, and the ashtray by her bedside was never empty. She no longer cared about her reflection. Her once beautiful skin dulled from neglect. Her clothes were either borrowed or torn. Her friends had vanished, most married off or moved on, and Ruth had become a woman no one wanted to sit too close to. Only the child remained, watching from a corner with wide eyes that Ruth refused to meet. Ruth's relationship with Alikia was not a relationship at all. It was a haunting. The child would follow her silently, eyes wide with longing, reaching out for warmth that never came. Ruth would flinch at the sound of her voice, lose her temper at simple questions, and sometimes shout at her for simply breathing too loudly. She rarely called her by name, referring to her as this child or that thing. The few moments of peace came only when Alikia slept. Sometimes Ruth would stand by the child's bed, staring at her tiny curled frame, wondering how something so small could have destroyed her so completely. But even in those quiet moments, love did not come. Instead, guilt would fester, grow wings, and crawl back into her bloodstream like a slow-moving poison. And so, she drank it down with more codeine, more smoke, more silence. When Mama Agnes passed away after a brief illness, Ruth didn't cry. She wore black, stood by the casket, and returned to her empty room with nothing but more silence. Her mother's death cut the final thread tying her to accountability. There was no one left to scold her, to look her in the eye and say, "This is not who I raised." Ruth became fully untethered. The neighborhood women stopped talking to her entirely. The church stopped visiting. Ruth had officially become what she used to fear, a woman alone, chained to her own past, addicted to forgetting. And Alikia? She learned to eat in silence, to speak only when spoken to, and to love herself in pieces because no one else ever had. Ruth's life took an unexpected turn one humid afternoon when she was hired as an event waitress at an elite bridal fashion show. She wore a faded black dress borrowed from another server and kept her head low. But even in her brokenness, Ruth's beauty had not fully dulled. It now carried a dangerous sharpness, like a rose with thorns. It was there that Chief Ibub first saw her, a billionaire in his mid-50s, dignified, powerful, with a cane in one hand and an eye for detail. He watched Ruth from across the room as she gracefully carried a tray of champagne glasses and nodded softly to each guest. Something about her posture, her silence, her storm hidden in a smile, drew him in. He was surrounded by women who wanted him, but Ruth didn't even look his way, and that intrigued him. Their meeting was brief but unforgettable. Chief Ibub approached her casually, commenting on her calm demeanor and graceful posture. Ruth was startled, unsure whether to speak or run. But when he slipped his business card into her palm and said, "Call me. I might have something better for a woman like you," her heart skipped. That night, she sat on her old foam mattress, staring at the glossy gold embossed card. Something about it felt dangerous, but also like an escape hatch. Days later, she called him. And from that single call, her life, for better or worse, began to shift. Ibub was direct, wealthy, and respected. He didn't ask many questions. He didn't need to. He saw what he wanted, and what he wanted was Ruth. Ruth cleaned herself up. She stopped smoking for now. She borrowed shoes from a friend, straightened her hair with hot water and a candle flame, and met Chief Ibub at a luxury hotel in Enugu. He didn't ask about her past, only her dreams. She lied with elegance. "I want to own a fashion empire. I was raised by my aunt. No family left." He nodded, charmed. But then came the final question that would decide everything. "Do you have a child?" Ruth hesitated for only a breath, then smiled sweetly. "No, sir. I've never had one." That one lie, birthed from years of shame and pain, would become the key to her new world. She went home that night, stared at Alikia's sleeping face, and made a decision that would change everything. Within the week, Ruth returned home, packed Alikia's small things, a torn teddy bear, 3 dresses, and a biscuit tin. The child asked, "Are we going on a journey, Mama?" Ruth didn't respond. She took her by the hand and led her to a distant cousin's home in Umwahia, a hard woman with 5 children of her own and barely any kindness to spare. "Take her," Ruth said, placing a wad of wrinkled naira notes into the cousin's hand. "Feed her, shelter her, do whatever you want with her." The cousin looked at her, confused. "Ruth, this is your daughter." "She is nothing," Ruth snapped, turning to leave. Alikia reached for her mother's wrapper and whispered, "Mummy, when will you come back?" Ruth pulled away and didn't look back. Not once. That moment would replay in Alikia's dreams for years to come. That night, Ruth checked into a hotel, got her nails done for the first time in years, and drank wine with Chief Ibub in a silk robe. She laughed at his jokes, batted her lashes, and let him call her queen. Days turned to weeks. He gave her a car, a driver, an apartment in Asakaro. She walked through luxury malls she had only seen in magazines. She was no longer the girl who reeked of codeine and rejection. She was now Mrs. Ruth Ibub, soon-to-be wife to a billionaire. She got featured in society columns and invited to elite women's networking events. The past was buried, locked in a village far from her new life. In this world, she told people she was raised by an orphan aunt in Benin, and that she had never known the warmth of a family. People clapped when she told her overcoming poverty story, and she smiled, perfectly made up, knowing every word was a lie. Meanwhile, back in Umwahia, Alikia's life turned into a slow-burning nightmare. The cousin beat her for breathing too loudly, fed her leftover Gary water, and made her fetch water from 2 compounds away. Her school uniforms were hand-me-downs, and her slippers had holes so wide her toes scraped the earth. She often stood at the back of classrooms, too ashamed to sit on broken chairs. She never spoke about her mother. When asked, she said, "She died when I was small." It was easier than admitting the truth, that her mother had chosen wealth over her, had tossed her away like trash. And though the girl never cried in public every night, she whispered to the ceiling, "I'll never forget." Ruth's transformation from forgotten single mother to high society goddess was faster than she had imagined. Within a year of marrying Chief Abub, she was living in a mansion in Akoi, surrounded by glass chandeliers, foreign wines, marble floors, and a walk-in closet full of luxury labels. She became a woman redefined by wealth, every photo carefully curated, every sentence rehearsed. Her story was that of a phoenix, a girl who rose from the dust of ABA to dine with queens, the newspapers called her. They celebrated her at women's galas, gave her awards she didn't earn, and called her a beacon for young girls. She let them, because each time someone praised her, it made the echo of her daughter's cries fainter. Ruth buried her past beneath imported perfume and expensive wigs. She didn't just wear designer gowns, she became a brand herself. With Chief Abub's influence and capital, Ruth launched House of Ruth Abub, a luxury fashion line that catered to elite women. The media couldn't get enough of her. Her PR team crafted a perfect narrative. Orphaned at 10, raised by a kind aunt in Benin, learned to sew by kerosene lanterns, and built her empire with nothing but faith and grace. Women adored her. Girls looked up to her. And Ruth smiled for every camera, every interview, every front page. But the lie was always there, a whisper under her breath, a heaviness in her chest. Because no matter how many makeup artists brushed her face, or how many stylists zipped her gowns, they couldn't hide the truth she'd buried in Umuahia. But behind the elegance and press coverage was a woman constantly battling her own shadow. Guilt didn't disappear with money, it simply dressed better. Ruth would lie awake at night, unable to shake the memory of a girl standing at a gate in Umuahia asking, "Mummy, when will you come back?" She blocked the memory with new perfumes, new parties, and endless photo shoots. But sometimes, when she stood before the mirror, flawless makeup, diamonds on her neck, she would see not herself, but her daughter's reflection staring back at her. The ghost of Alikia never left. It clung to her in quiet moments. It danced behind her eyelids when she closed her eyes. And though the world saw a queen, Ruth knew, deep inside, that her empire was built on abandonment. Meanwhile, in the dim backroom of a corporate building in Lagos, Alikia was growing into a woman molded by fire. Life in Umuahia had taught her to endure without breaking. After turning 18, she left the cousin's home with no money, no luggage, only courage and a small envelope that contained her primary school certificate and a few tattered photos. She took a night bus to Lagos and found work cleaning offices at dawn. Then, one day, fate opened a door. A janitorial agency assigned her to a large fashion and textile company. Ironically, the very company her mother co-owned. She had no idea whose name was on the building. She was just grateful for the mop, the uniform, and a salary that could buy real bread. She worked hard, harder than anyone else. She never complained, never asked for favors. If there was extra work to do, she volunteered. If someone needed help, she offered. The HR department took notice. Within 6 months, she was offered a junior assistant role, the lowest rung of administration, but still higher than where she began. She started learning on the job, filing reports, arranging schedules, even helping plan internal events. No one knew she hadn't gone to university. Her efficiency spoke for her. Her poise spoke for her. Her quiet hunger to grow, to matter, to be seen, it shone in everything she did. The world had never given her anything, so she learned how to take it the right way, through sweat and grace. The irony was that she still didn't know the name of the woman who owned the brand she worked so hard for. She only knew the initials, HRE. The upper floors of the company were like another world, rarely accessed by junior staff. Occasionally, she heard the name Mrs. Ruth Abub mentioned in meetings, but it meant nothing to her. She didn't watch TV, and she never cared for celebrity culture. Her goal was simple: rise. She wanted to climb, succeed, survive. And unknowingly, she was building the legacy of the very woman who had once called her a burden. The universe has a way of folding time, and Alikia was about to walk face first into the past she had buried. Chief Ibub rarely mingled with lower staff, but the first time he met Alikia was during a quarterly review session where junior team leads were invited to observe. She wasn't supposed to speak, just listen. But when a miscalculation in a logistics report caused panic in the room, Alikia gently raised her hand. Her correction, delivered softly but confidently, saved the company from a costly error. Chief Ibub, impressed, asked for her name. She said, "Alikia, sir." And from that day on, he remembered it. Her name became a fixture in his conversations. He began watching her rise, step by step, not because she was beautiful, but because she carried herself with rare dignity. She reminded him of what he imagined a daughter would be like. He began to ask about her in meetings. "How is that girl, Alikia, doing?" he would casually mention. When told she'd been promoted to project coordinator, he nodded in approval. "Smart girl," he said. "Reminds me of what a daughter should be." His words weren't performative. He genuinely meant them. He admired her diligence, her humility, her refusal to be seen. It was as if she carried the kind of quiet strength that could not be taught, only earned. He told Ruth during dinner one evening, "There's this girl in our company. You really should meet her. She's got something special." Ruth barely lifted her fork. "Another staff member?" she said, uninterested. "Yes," he replied. "But not just another. You'll see." Ruth barely reacted at first, just another girl, she assumed. But the mention became frequent. "She's so composed. She's brilliant with numbers. You should meet her." And then, one morning, as Ruth walked through the corridor on her way to a meeting, she passed by the reception desk and saw Alikia for the first time. Their eyes met. Ruth froze. There, standing with a pen in her hand, was the mirror image of her youth. The same eyes, the same lips, the same fire. Ruth's knees went weak. She rushed into the nearest restroom and locked herself in. Her hands shook. Her chest burned. She splashed water on her face, but it couldn't wash away what she'd just seen. The past had come back wearing a staff ID badge. Ruth didn't return to the office for 2 full days. She claimed she was attending a charity gala in Abuja, but in truth, she stayed locked in her bedroom, pacing like a ghost, unable to shake the image of that girl's face. Her face. The moment had been quick, just a glance in the hallway, but it had unraveled years of carefully buried shame. Ruth knew that face. She had seen it in mirrors, in old photos, in dreams that turned to nightmares. There was no doubt in her heart. The girl Chief Ibub kept praising was her daughter. The same one she had abandoned with a biscuit tin and a torn wrapper. The child she had told herself would never return. But now not only had she returned, she had found her way to Ruth's doorstep, her business, and worst of all, her husband's heart. Back in the office, Alikia continued her work as usual, unaware of the emotional earthquake her presence had triggered. She was focused on preparing reports for a new fashion launch and managing customer feedback surveys. She noticed, though, that some of the senior managers began looking at her with subtle curiosity, as though something about her was beginning to click in their minds too. She ignored it, choosing to stay focused. She had come too far to let distraction derail her. She was finally finding her rhythm, a woman rising through hard work, dignity, and quiet tenacity. She hadn't forgotten her past, but she no longer let it define her. It was a scar she wore beneath her smile, invisible but permanent. That night, Ruth opened an old locked box in the back of her closet. Inside were faded photographs, a small pair of baby socks, and the birth certificate she had once told herself she'd burned. She held the paper in trembling hands and wept, not from maternal longing, but from fear. Fear that her secret had finally grown teeth. Fear that the life she had erased had returned not as a beggar, but as a rising star in the very company she ruled. She called her cousin Inumwahia, the one who raised Alikia. "Did she ever ask about me?" Ruth whispered. The woman on the other end was blunt. "She doesn't talk about you, but I think she never forgot." Ruth hung up without replying. Her past was no longer a memory. It was now flesh and blood, walking her hallways. Ruth's next move was subtle, calculated. She didn't want to confront Alikia, not yet. Instead, she began manipulating the HR department to quietly relocate her. She suggested restructuring to streamline departments and hinted that Alikia's talents might be better suited to an external PR affiliate. But Chief Ibube caught wind of it. During a board meeting, he casually asked, "Why are we moving Alikia out of headquarters? She's one of the most efficient minds we have." HR stammered, offered excuses. Ruth stayed silent, her eyes fixed on her notepad. The motion was dropped. Alikia would stay. Ruth had underestimated just how deeply her husband valued the girl. And now, that loyalty had become a threat. Ruth realized she was losing control, not just of the situation, but of her own emotions. Each time she walked into a room, she feared she might see her daughter. Each time she opened her email, she worried it might be a message from someone who had connected the dots. Her world, once a fortress built on lies and curated appearances, was now as fragile as glass. And the more she saw Alikia rising through the company ranks, the more her anxiety ate away at her peace. She started drinking again, quietly, in the corners of her room. Small glasses of red wine at first, then whiskey, then brandy. It helped her sleep, helped her forget, helped her pretend this wasn't all falling apart. Alikia, on the other hand, remained blissfully unaware. She was now part of the creative development team, a role that allowed her to attend select executive meetings and assist in product line reviews. It was during one of those meetings that she handed Ruth a design folder, without knowing who she truly was. Their fingers touched briefly. Ruth recoiled as if burned. Alikia apologized, confused. Ruth mumbled something and turned away. That night, Ruth sat in her car long after the meeting ended, staring at her reflection in the rearview mirror. For the first time in a long while, she didn't recognize the woman staring back. She wasn't the queen of fashion. She was a frightened mother running from truth she could no longer outrun. The final straw came when Chief Ibube, ever generous, invited Alikia to the mansion for a weekend staff retreat, a casual brunch with wine and team bonding. It was the first time Alikia stepped into the personal world of the man who had championed her rise. The house was breathtaking, wrapped in marble and gold accents, a palace that seemed to belong to another universe. Alikia walked through the hallway with admiration, touching the edges of framed paintings and wondering what it felt like to live like this. For a moment, she was no longer the girl from Omwahia. She was a woman standing in the light, welcomed, valued, seen. And she had no idea the owner of the home was the same woman who had once called her curse. Ruth walked in just as Chief Ibube was pouring Alikia a glass of champagne. For a moment, no one spoke. Ruth's heart thundered against her chest as the sight of her daughter, in her home, laughing with her husband, hit her like a thunderclap. But she masked it quickly. "Ah, you must be the famous Alikia," she said with a forced smile. "My husband talks about you endlessly." Alikia, flattered, rose to greet her. "Ma'am, it's an honor." Ruth touched her shoulder gently, but her fingers trembled. That night, she excused herself early, claiming she was tired. She spent the rest of the evening staring at the chandelier in her bedroom, her heart refusing to settle. The past had moved into her living room, and it was wearing heels. That night, Ruth stood at the balcony, watching Alikia from afar as she walked around the garden. Chief Ibube was beside her, laughing, pointing out the koi pond, talking about business like he was grooming her for leadership. And Ruth, silent, cold, and cornered, realized something unbearable. This girl, this child she had once thrown away, was everything she had wanted to be. Everything Ruth pretended to be, Alikia simply was. And the part that cut deepest? The man she had sacrificed everything to keep now looked at her daughter like the legacy he'd been searching for all along. The days that followed the mansion visit stretched like slow-burning candles. Ruth avoided the office almost entirely, choosing instead to work remotely or hide in her private suite. She couldn't bring herself to face Alikia, not after seeing her walk so confidently through halls Ruth once ruled. Each update from assistants only confirmed what she feared. The staff admired Alikia. Chief Ibub even mentioned her as a future board advisor. She has a voice this brand needs, he'd said, pride swelling in his voice. Ruth's face would tighten. She'd sip her wine and smile thinly, pretending it didn't feel like poison. Each compliment toward Alikia felt like an insult hurled at the life Ruth had tried to build by burying her past. Chief Ibub, kind and observant, sensed something was wrong. "Is everything okay with you?" he asked one evening. Ruth forced a laugh. "Hormones. I'm just tired," she said, waving him off with a practiced grin. But in the silence of her walk-in closet or the solitude of her spa suite, she wept. Her husband continued to bring home news about Alikia, her rise, her grace, her efficiency. He even suggested taking her to a global fashion conference in Milan. Ruth nearly dropped her glass. "She's not ready for that level," she said coldly, masking fear as professionalism. Ibub brushed it off, unfazed. "Maybe. Or maybe she's what we've been waiting for." That night, Ruth didn't sleep. She lay awake in her silk sheets, haunted by the daughter she thought she'd erased. Some days, Ruth stood behind the tinted glass of her top-floor office and watched Alikia below, walking with fire, greeting people with poise, handling meetings with a calm Ruth never knew at that age. She saw herself in the posture, but not in the energy. Alikia didn't have the desperate hunger Ruth had. She had quiet strength, grace without apology. Ruth realized then that Alikia had become the kind of woman Ruth pretended to be. She had earned every compliment, every promotion. Ruth's heart swelled with conflict, part pride, part fear, mostly guilt. She wanted to scream, confess, erase the years of abandonment. But shame stitched her lips shut. Watching her daughter shine was both a blessing and a curse. Like seeing the sun that warmed you also burned the skin you thought had healed. It began with a misplaced report, a trivial error, hardly worth a formal meeting. But Ruth used it as an excuse. She summoned Alikia to her office directly. It was their first face-to-face since the dinner at the mansion. The moment Alikia stepped in, the air thickened with tension. Ruth sat behind her mahogany desk, her posture rigid. Alikia stood calmly, composed as always. "You called for me?" she asked. Ruth nodded, not meeting her eyes. "Sit." The accusation came fast. Ruth claimed Alikia had failed to submit her project updates on time. Alikia responded with grace and facts. But Ruth wasn't listening to her words. She was responding to her presence, to her power, to the silent echo of her own guilt. The argument spiraled. Ruth's word sharpened, becoming personal. "You think you're above the process because the board likes you," she snapped. Alikia furrowed her brows. "Ma'am, I respect process. What I don't understand is your hatred for me." Ruth blinked. "Excuse me. From the day I arrived, you've treated me like I'm your enemy," Alikia said softly. And then something cracked. Ruth's voice rose. "You want to know why? Because your father left me. Because I was just a girl when I carried you, and you ruined everything. He ran, said I cheated, said I was loose. And then he vanished. And I was left with you. A burden. A curse. I had no life after that. Nothing." Her voice broke on the last word, and the room fell into silence. "I see now," Alikia said slowly, her voice like steady thunder. "You're my mother." Her words didn't sound like a question. Ruth's body folded in on itself like a crumbling wall. "You shouldn't have come here," she whispered. Alikia stood taller. "I didn't come for you. I came for a chance at life. I came to build something. And I did it without you. The man you married. He treats me like a daughter. You never did." With that, she turned, her heels clicking on the marble like a countdown. Ruth sat there, breathless, undone. The truth had clawed its way into the open, and now it could not be buried again. Chief Ibub had been walking down the corridor when he heard raised voices. The door wasn't fully shut. As he drew closer, he paused, not to eavesdrop, but because something in Ruth's voice was strange. Then he heard the words. Every syllable landed like a brick to the chest. "You ruined my life. Your father left me. You're my daughter." Ibub froze. The hallway blurred. By the time Alikia stormed past him in tears, she barely noticed him standing there. Their eyes met briefly, hers filled with pain, his with dawning horror. He didn't say a word. Neither did she. But his world was unraveling with each step she took away from that door. He didn't go back to his office. He went to a hotel and sat in the dark. The memories came in waves: Ruth's evasiveness, her contradictory stories about her upbringing, the mysterious aunt who raised her, the gaps in her past. It all made sense now. The girl he had admired, encouraged, mentored like a father, was her daughter. The daughter she abandoned, lied about, pretended never existed. And the woman he married had allowed him to unknowingly praise the very child she once discarded like trash. His heart broke, not just for Alikia, but for the version of himself that believed Ruth's lies. The next morning, he returned to the mansion. Ruth met him at the entrance, her face pale and frantic. "I can explain," she whispered. He shook his head. "Don't." She tried again, but he silenced her with a single look. "I gave you everything. I praised her because she deserved it. And all this time, you let me." Ruth dropped to her knees. "Please, I don't hate you," he said. "But I don't recognize you anymore." He walked past her, heading toward the guest wing to pack his things. Ruth sobbed in the doorway, but Abub never looked back. Her house, her empire, her lies, all of it trembled under the weight of the truth she tried to bury. Chief Abub didn't shout. He didn't raise his hands or curse Ruth for her betrayal. That would have been easier to bear. Instead, he packed his belongings with quiet disappointment and the finality of a man who had seen enough. Ruth watched from the top of the stairs as he zipped his luggage and paused at the door. "I praised the child you abandoned," he said softly. "And you stood there, watching, letting me do it." Then he left, no goodbye, no backward glance. Within days, the news broke that Chief Abub had withdrawn his shares from the company and taken an indefinite sabbatical. What no one expected was the bombshell that followed. He transferred those shares to Alikia. The board members, shocked but impressed by her discipline and vision, voted unanimously to offer her full creative leadership. Ruth had not only lost her husband, she had lost her empire, to the very girl she tried to erase. There was no formal announcement of Ruth's demotion, no press conference stripping her of her title. But everyone in the building knew the shift had happened. Staff members who once ran to open her doors now sent emails with CC, Alikia at the top. Designers she had personally mentored now met with Alikia behind glass conference doors. Ruth's office remained untouched, but its silence became heavier with each passing day. She began to skip meetings, preferring to pace her garden or stare out of windows that no longer offered peace. She watched the company she built from the ashes of her shame flourish under the hands of the daughter she rejected. But this time, no one blamed her. They simply forgot her. Alikia didn't seek revenge, nor did she gloat. She didn't change the locks or humiliate Ruth publicly. Instead, she ran the company with quiet brilliance. And that made it worse. Some nights, Ruth would hear applause from the boardroom. Not for her. Never for her. Once, she crept down the hallway in her silk robe and stood by the door, listening to her daughter deliver a flawless presentation. The same daughter she dropped off with a stranger in a dusty village and never looked back. Now the world looked at her with awe. Alikia's vision for the brand was vibrant, inclusive, fearless. She reached markets Ruth had never considered. She introduced collections inspired by untold African stories, not royalty, but resilience. She made the brand human again. Ruth couldn't understand how the girl she left behind had grown into a woman of such power without spite. And perhaps that's what broke her the most. Ruth had spent decades stepping on people to rise. Alikia rose from being stepped on and stood taller. Alikia's first move as creative director was subtle but seismic. She dropped House of Ruth and rebranded the empire simply as Eli. The announcement shook the industry. Overnight, billboards across the city changed. The new slogan read, "Built by Fire." It was bold. It was personal. It was poetic justice without naming names. Her first campaign featured women who had been scarred, overlooked, and underestimated, survivors of fire accidents, widows, girls from poor backgrounds, and even single mothers. It was a tribute to strength, not perfection. Critics praised it as revolutionary. Sales doubled. The internet lit up with praise. Eli is not just fashion, one journalist wrote. It's testimony stitched in silk. Behind the applause was a silent dagger to Ruth's heart. The name that had once dominated the skyline now belonged to the daughter she had tried to forget. But Alikia wasn't done. She rolled out scholarship programs under the Eli Foundation, naming it after her grandmother, Mama Agnes. She returned to her childhood village to launch a textile training institute for rural women. Everywhere she went, she left light. She didn't mention Ruth in interviews. When reporters asked about her childhood, she said, "Let's talk about the future." Her restraint earned her even more admiration. Even employees who once mocked her when she was a janitor now stood proudly in her meetings. Ruth, meanwhile, watched from the shadows. She saw her daughter reshape the brand with grace and thunder. She heard Abub praising her on radio interviews. She's the future. The brand is safe with her. And every word felt like another nail sealing Ruth's irrelevance. It wasn't just business that Alikia transformed. It was legacy. Where Ruth had built walls, Alikia built bridges. She hosted workshops for creative teenagers, funded counseling for abused young women, and gave internships to girls who had dropped out of school. She led with empathy, something Ruth never had time for. The public adored her, not as Ruth's successor, but as her own woman. Her quiet charisma drew celebrities, investors, and youth leaders alike. And through it all, she never once attacked Ruth. No scandals. No secrets leaked. Just silent excellence. Ruth sat in her winged armchair and watched as her crown passed to the child she tried to throw away. It didn't fall. It fit perfectly. The billboard outside Ruth's estate glowed like a taunt. Eli, built by fire. Every morning, when the sun hid her blinds just right, that slogan burned into her walls like scripture. She tried to change the billboard, sent agents, offered bribes, but the city said no. It was legally owned. She couldn't escape it. It was poetic. Ruth stopped attending society events. Her friends, once eager to dine at her table, now courted Alikia. Even journalists stopped calling. Her once glamorous wing of the mansion became a graveyard of gowns and perfume. The servants, too, had changed. They no longer rushed at the sound of her bell. Some quietly handed in resignations, choosing to work under Miss Eli. And in all of it, Ruth realized something more painful than shame. She had become irrelevant in a kingdom she once ruled. Her health began to fade, not from disease, but from a loneliness that eats flesh like acid. She started skipping meals, grew thinner, paler. Some nights she'd wander the garden barefoot, whispering apologies into the breeze. "I never meant to hate you. I just didn't know how to love you." But the wind gave no reply. She would stand under the balcony where Alikia now filmed interviews, hoping to catch a glance. But her daughter never looked down. Ruth wanted to scream, to run to her, to beg. But pride, that thing she had clung to all her life, wouldn't let her kneel. So she brewed her tea, sat in silence, and watched the throne she lost flourish without her. One stormy night, Ruth stood by the window and watched Alikia arrive at the house, this time in a chauffeured car. Cameras flashed. Alikia waved, radiant. And Ruth, hidden behind her curtain, whispered, "That's my daughter." The words hurt her chest. She hadn't said them aloud in 20 years. She remembered the last time she saw Alikia's young face, terrified, confused, clinging to a stranger's wrapper as Ruth walked away. She could still hear the girl crying, "Mama." Ruth had never turned back. And now, as thunder rolled in the sky, she realized she would give anything to rewind that moment, to say, "Come with me." But there was no more with me. Alikia had created her own kingdom. And Ruth had banished herself from it long ago. It was a quiet Saturday morning, the kind where the air smelled of slow regret and last chances. Ruth sat in the back garden, dressed in a once elegant wrapper now faded with time and indifference. Her hands trembled as she poured herself tea, the porcelain clinking like a warning. She didn't hear the footsteps until they were nearly upon her. When she looked up, Alikia stood there, poised, glowing, dressed in an understated cream gown and flat sandals. She carried no bitterness in her stance, no anger in her eyes. Just resolve. Ruth's lips parted, but the words caught. For the first time in over 20 years, they were face to face, without disguise, status, or pretense. Ruth gestured weakly to the empty chair beside her. Alikia sat, legs crossed, hands folded on her lap. The silence was thick, but not uncomfortable. Ruth, unable to look directly at her, began, "You're doing well." Alikia nodded, but said nothing. Ruth tried again. "I see you in the papers, people love you." Still, no reply. So she said what she had avoided her whole life. "I'm sorry." Alikia's eyes lifted slowly. Not angry, not moved, just steady. "You don't have to be sorry," she said finally. "You made your choices. I made mine. You walked away. I walked forward." Ruth swallowed hard. "I don't deserve your kindness," she whispered. And Alikia's voice, calm and slow, replied, "You were never kind. I survived without you. I don't hate you, but I'll never forget." They sat there, two women bound by blood and shattered time. Alikia didn't stay long. She rose gently, like a queen who knew her crown didn't need defending. "I only came because the child in me needed closure," she said. "Not the woman. The woman moved on years ago." Ruth watched her walk away with tears pooling behind her eyes. No dramatic hug. No forgiveness. Just clarity. The footsteps grew distant and then disappeared. Ruth sat still for a long while, her cup now cold, her hands resting on her knees like someone awaiting judgment. The birds sang again, but it wasn't peace, it was resignation. The daughter she hated now had the dignity she never could buy. And Ruth remained, surrounded by silence, and the echo of what could never be undone. The staff retreat was held on a mountaintop estate, surrounded by clouds and crisp air that tasted of beginnings. Alikia stood on a small open-air stage, framed by lanterns and the glow of morning light. She wore simple jeans, a white top, and her natural hair packed up in a soft bun. No jewelry, no makeup, just power in its purest form. Her team, designers, marketers, assistants, sat cross-legged on mats, watching her with reverence. She smiled softly, breathing in the moment. "I wasn't supposed to be here," she said, breaking the calm. "They said I was a mistake, but I became the standard." Her voice was low, but every syllable struck with force. She didn't need applause. She didn't wait for cheers. She simply walked off the stage, her message left hanging in the air like gospel. Later that afternoon, a photographer snapped a photo of her standing alone by the cliffs, wind catching her scarf, eyes toward the horizon. That image would go on to define her legacy. It graced the cover of magazines, the walls of offices, and the phone backgrounds of young girls across the continent. Ruth saw it too. In her room, where dust now coated her gold-framed mirrors, she stared at the magazine cover for hours. "Eli built by fire." The tagline burned more than any headline. She had tried to bury her past, to rename her story, but the very child she abandoned had renamed her legacy. Ruth no longer existed in the public's eyes as a pioneer. She was simply the woman who birthed a phoenix and tried to smother its flame. Years passed. Alikia built her empire, expanding into education, tech, and arts. Her story was told not through words, but through actions, scholarships, rescue shelters, empowerment grants. She never publicly addressed Ruth, never aired her pain, but her existence was a constant reminder that shame cannot kill destiny, and silence doesn't erase truth. People who knew whispered it in circles. "That's her mother, you know," but Alikia never confirmed or denied. She had no need to. She had taken the throne, not by fighting, not by begging, but by rising. Ruth faded into obscurity, not as punishment, but as the natural end of her choices. And in the center of every billboard, in every successful campaign, one name lived and thrived. Eli, not the child she hated, the woman she couldn't stop. Thank you for watching this video. What did you learn from this story? Drop it in the comments. Please make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel TOCHI Stories for more.